Welcome to the History Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a really difficult, confronting chapter of human experience, one that really challenges our understanding of leadership, power, and, frankly, cruelty.
hmm
We're delving into a profound and disturbing question. Was Saddam Hussein a psychopath?
It's a heavy question, absolutely. And when you examine Saddam Hussein's time ruling Iraq, his actions, well, they really do align quite closely with what psychological profiles often describe as malignant narcissism.
Malignant narcissism, that sounds more complex than just arrogance.
Oh, much more. It's understood as a really dangerous mix. You've got psychopathy, severe pathological narcissism, deep-seated paranoia, and just completely unconstrained aggression all rolled into one.
Wow.
And it's not just armchair psychology. His own personal physician, al-Bashir, someone who was in Hussein's inner circle for 2 decades, he flat out described him as a psychopath.
His own doctor.
Yes. Bashir said he was, quote, friendly and polite, but ruthless toward his enemies and challengers. What's truly chilling, though, is the doctor's assertion that Hussein expressed absolutely no regret for the immense suffering he caused.
No regret. That lack of empathy, that complete disregard for human suffering. It seems to be a recurring theme when you look at his rule, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It's central to understanding his actions. His behavior showcased this complete lack of empathy and a terrifying willingness to commit any atrocity necessary to consolidate and maintain his power.
And the scale of the impact, it's almost impossible to comprehend. Under his authority, estimates suggest somewhere between 250,000 and 290,000 people either died or just disappeared.
Vanished, exactly. It's a staggering number. And these weren't just casualties of war in the traditional sense.
No. That sheer number, it forces us to look beyond just the statistics, doesn't it? To try and grasp the systematic nature of the terror he imposed.
Precisely. A leader whose actions align with such a severe psychological profile, especially malignant narcissism, it suggests the cruelty wasn't random. It wasn't arbitrary fits of rage. It was deeply integrated into his method of governance, a tool.
So to really understand the scope of this devastation, we need to start by confronting the deliberate use of mass violence, the campaigns that many people, quite rightly, consider genocidal. Where do we begin? What were the most significant examples of this calculated brutality?
Well, the regime's operations, as you said, weren't random. They were deliberate, systematic campaigns, all designed to instill absolute terror and consolidate power. The most, I suppose, harrowing examples would have to include the Anfal campaign against the Kurds, the truly horrific chemical attack on Halabja, the decades-long persecution of the Fili Kurds, and the Dujail massacre.
Okay.
And it's crucial to understand these weren't just isolated incidents happening by chance. They were deliberate policies orchestrated from the top, all aimed at maintaining power through fear and, in some cases, the literal eradication of perceived threats.
That consistent pattern across different groups, different times, it really points to that underlying psychological framework you mentioned, that paranoia and unchecked aggression.
Exactly. Relentlessly applied.
Okay, let's start with the Anfal campaign then. It sounds like an operation of just immense scale targeting an entire community. Can you walk us through what Anfal actually entailed? How did it exemplify Saddam's strategy?
Right, Anfal. It ran roughly from February to September 1988. And it was a sustained, incredibly brutal military operation, primarily against the rural Kurdish population in northern Iraq.
Primarily the Kurds.
Yes, though other non-Arab groups got caught up in it too. But the express purpose, directly ordered by Saddam Hussein himself, was twofold. First, eliminate the Kurdish resistance groups, the Peshmerga, who challenged his rule. And second, fundamentally reshape the demographics of strategic areas, especially around the oil-rich Kirkuk governorate. The goal was forced Arabization.
So it wasn't just military suppression, it was demographic engineering.
Precisely. Driven by the regime's paranoia and its desire for total control over resources and populations. And the man put in charge of leading it was Hussein's cousin, Ali Hassan al-Majid.
Ah, Chemical Ali.
The very same, a name he earned for his enthusiastic use of chemical weapons during Anfal. The tactics employed were just devastating in their scope. You had relentless ground assaults, constant aerial bombings, and, yes, widespread chemical warfare. Alongside that, the systematic demolition of entire settlements' villages wiped off the map. Mass deportations, and summary firing squads.
How many villages are we talking about?
It's estimated that around 1,200 Kurdish villages were utterly destroyed during this period, turned vast areas into just scorched earth.
1,200.
And the campaign itself was meticulously planned. It unfolded in 8 distinct phases.
8 phases?
8. Each phase targeting different areas, allowing for a methodical, comprehensive sweep. The initial phases focused mainly on areas controlled by the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, or PEK. Then it moved progressively through other regions, with the final phase hitting areas held by the Kurdish Democratic Party, the KDP.
This phased approach, it sounds clinical, designed to leave no escape.
That seems to have been exactly the intention.
Yeah.
Methodical eradication.
8 distinct phases. That's an extraordinary level of sustained, almost industrial-scale attack. Can you give us a deeper sense of the specific horrors, particularly how the chemical weapons were used in these phases?
Absolutely. The chemical weapons were a signature of Anfal. They turned entire landscapes into death zones almost overnight. Take Anfal 2, that was late March, early April '88. The Kara Dagh region was just saturated with poison gas. Villages like Safran, Susan, and Balekjar, they became targets.
And people trying to flee.
Many were caught. And a common tactic was to forcibly separate the men from the women and children right there. A deliberate cruelty designed to break families and exert control. The women and children were then carted off to detention camps, their fate at that point completely uncertain.
That separation tactic, it speaks volumes about the cold-blooded planning.
It does. Then came Anfal 3 in April '88, targeting the Garmian region. During this phase, countless women and children just disappeared, vanished into the system. Tazashar was one of the places hit by chemical attacks then. And here we see a particularly sinister tactic. The regime broadcasts fake amnesty offers over mosque loudspeakers. They lured desperate villagers into surrendering.
Offering safety.
Exactly. But anyone who surrendered was immediately detained. Men often separated out again. This use of false promises followed by betrayal. It shows such a profound cynicism about human life.
Just pure manipulation.
Then Anfal 4, early May '88. More major poison gas attacks, this time in the Little Zab Valley, places like Askar and Guptapa. And again, another false amnesty announced, leading to mass arrests, more separations.
They kept using the same trick.
Yes. It confirms it was a calculated part of the strategy. Then you had Anfal 5, 6, and 7. These were 3 consecutive attacks running from mid-May right through to mid-August '88. Focused on the Rwandese and Shakawa valleys. Hiran, Balasan, Smakuli, Malakan, Sheklasan, Ware, Saran, Kaniba. Village after village hit with poison gas. The sheer number of locations targeted just underscores how extensive this chemical warfare campaign was.
It's relentless.
And finally, the last phase, Anfal 8, late August into early September '88. This targeted the Bedanin region. Villages like Vermili, Barkivre, Bilajane hit with chemical assaults. And crucially, the Iraqi army then blocked the routes towards Turkey, cutting off escape. They rounded up anyone who couldn't get out.
And then?
The men were executed on the spot, women and children transported to camps. The goal seems to have been to ensure no witnesses, no survivors from the male population remained in these areas.
Just complete erasure. And what about the thousands captured during these phases? You mentioned detention camps. What were they like?
They were another layer of the nightmare, absolutely. Thousands of captives were sent to these horrific facilities. They were designed for control and, well, in many cases, slow death through neglect and abuse. Dibs was one, mainly for women and children, near an army training facility. From there, many were moved to Nugra Salman.
Nugra Salman?
Yes, a really remote desert camp. Estimates suggest it held between 5,000 and 8,000 prisoners. Conditions were unimaginable. Starvation, disease were rampant. Another key site was Tupsawa, near an army base outside Kirkuk.
And the outcome of all this?
By September 1988, when Anfal officially ended, the vast majority of the male population between 15 and 50 in those targeted Kurdish areas was either dead or had managed to flee. The women, children, and elderly who survived the camps were eventually released. But, and this is crucial, they were explicitly forbidden from returning to their destroyed homes and villages.
Forbidden. So where did they go?
They were confined to other military-controlled camps, basically resettlement camps, until 1991, when Iraqi Kurdistan gained regional autonomy after the Gulf War.
The long-term impact. It must be immense.
Oh, profound. The destruction of communities, the loss of life, the psychological scars. It's still deeply felt today, this systematic destruction of identity, community, land. It's a chilling hallmark of that, well, that psychopathic drive for total control we talked about.
Beyond the broader Anfal campaign, the Halabja chemical attack stands out as this singularly devastating event, a name that's become synonymous with state-sponsored terror. Can you describe the specific horrors of that day and its lasting impact?
Halabja, yes.
Ah.
March 16th, 1988. It wasn't isolated, as you say. It was an integral, horrific part of Anfal. Yeah. But it was unique in its concentrated fury against a civilian town. It was designed to inflict maximum casualties and psychological terror. On that day, Iraqi bombers first shelled Halabja, a town of about 60,000 people then.
Yeah.
This shelling forced residents into their cellars, into basements.
Driving them underground.
Exactly. A deliberate act to trap them in confined spaces. Then as dusk fell, and for about 5 hours into the night, Iraqi planes and helicopters returned. This time, they blanketed the city with a chemical cocktail.
What kind of chemicals?
Mustard gas, nerve agents, sarin, taboon, possibly VX, and other choking agents. These compounds are heavier than air, so they seeped relentlessly down into the buildings, into the cellars where people were desperately seeking shelter.
Oh.
The effects were immediate and grotesque. People suffocated, they convulsed, they vomited blood, their skin blistered, burned. Eyewitness accounts are just harrowing. Images of families dead in the streets, frozen in their last moments. The immediate death toll is estimated at around 5,000 civilians.
5,000 in one attack.
Yes, and another 10,000 people suffered immediate injuries, blinding, maiming, severe disfigurement from the chemical burns.
And the horror didn't end there, did it? The long-term effects.
No, it didn't. They were equally devastating. Thousands more succumbed in the following years and decades to severe health complications directly linked to the exposure. Survivors of Halabja experienced dramatically elevated rates of cancers, particularly colon cancer, chronic respiratory diseases that never went away, and alarming rates of miscarriages and infertility among women. The genetic damage was significant.
The land, too, I imagine.
Catastrophic environmental impact rendered large areas infertile for years. And then, as a final insult, the city itself was razed to the ground by the Iraqi army in July 1988, wiped away.
Just erased.
Halabja stands as this enduring, horrifying symbol of extreme state-sponsored chemical warfare against a state's own people. It reveals a complete absence of human empathy, a willingness to unleash unspeakable suffering on a massive scale.
The targeting of specific ethnic groups didn't stop with the Kurds in Anfal or Halabja, did it? You mentioned the Faili Kurds earlier. Their persecution was prolonged, spanning decades. What did that involve?
That's right. The persecution of the Faili Kurds was relentless, systematic, and incredibly long-lasting. It started as early as 1970 and continued right up until the fall of the regime in 2003.
Over 30 years. Yes. Initiated directly by Saddam Hussein. This wasn't a sudden outburst. It was a calculated, long-term policy rooted in xenophobia and this Ba'athist desire to consolidate a specific Arab-centric identity in Iraq. A key moment was the Revolutionary Command Council decision, Decree 666. This decree arbitrarily stripped Faili Kurds of their Iraqi nationality. They were just reclassified as Iranians, even though many families had lived in Iraq for generations, centuries even.
Making them stateless in their own country.
Exactly.
Oh.
Completely vulnerable. It paved the way for systematic executions, which started in Baghdad and Kanakin in 1979 and then spread. It's estimated that around 25,000 Faili Kurds died due to captivity and torture under the regime.
25,000.
And perhaps even more chillingly, over 10,000 Faili Kurdish males were forcibly separated from their families in the 1980s, deported to Iran, and then just disappeared. Never seen again.
Forced disappearance on a mass scale.
Yes. It was ethnic cleansing, aimed at eradicating a community's presence, its identity. It demonstrates the regime's willingness to erase entire segments of its population if they didn't fit the desired mold or were perceived as somehow disloyal.
And then there's the Dujail massacre in 1982. This one seems particularly personal, triggered by an assassination attempt on Saddam himself. How did that unfold, and what does the response tell us about his approach?
Dujail is a classic example of Saddam's extreme, deeply personal brand of retribution. It happened after an assassination attempt on his convoy as it passed through the predominantly Shiite town of Dujail. The punishment was immediate, brutal, and shockingly disproportionate. It extended far, far beyond anyone potentially involved in the attack. It was a raw demonstration of absolute vengeful power, very reflective of that paranoid and aggressively punitive mindset.
What happened immediately?
About 160 men and boys were killed right away. Saddam's security forces reportedly just opened fire on townspeople in the streets. But the brutality didn't stop there. It escalated dramatically. Up to 1,500 people, entire families, men, women, children, were rounded up by the Mukhabarat, the secret police. They were taken to detention centers in Tikrit and Baghdad.
1,500 people rounded up.
Yes, and then 3 years later, after what can only be described as a sham trial, 143 men and boys from Dujail were formally condemned to death by Saddam's revolutionary court. They were executed by hanging in the infamous Abu Ghraib prison.
And the others? The rest of the 1,500?
Many others were sent to a remote desert prison near the Saudi border. Conditions there were horrific. Dozens died, women, children, even infants from starvation, disease, neglect, abuse.
It's just unimaginable cruelty.
And to completely destroy the community, to ensure it couldn't recover, the regime systematically bulldozed over 250,000 acres of the region's date, palm groves and orchards.
Their entire livelihood.
Yes, the economic backbone of Dujail. Gone. This wasn't just punishment for an attack. It was an act of collective annihilation, designed to send an unmistakable message across Iraq. Any challenge to Saddam Hussein, no matter how small, would be met with overwhelming, devastating retribution. It was pure, unconstrained aggression, total disregard for human life.
The scale of these attacks, Anfal, Halabja, Dujail, the Faili Kurds, and the sheer disproportionality of the retribution, it's deeply disturbing. It really wasn't just about mass killings, was it? It was about wielding terror itself as an instrument of power.
Absolutely. The regime functioned on that simple, brutal principle, deeply rooted in that malignant narcissism complex. Any challenge, any perceived slight, no matter how small, warranted a response of overwhelming, often unimaginable cruelty. The goal was always to crush any hint of dissent through sheer terror, demonstrating the absolute futility of opposition. Make everyone feel unsafe, make it clear the state's reach was total.
And we saw this play out on a massive scale after the Gulf War.
Yes. The crushing of the 1991 uprisings is a stark, devastating example. After Iraq's defeating Kuwait, popular uprisings erupted, spontaneous explosions of hope and anger in the Kurdish north and the Shia south. People thought perhaps the regime was weakened.
But Saddam's response was
Utterly brutal. He unleashed the full force of his military, especially the Republican Guard, against his own population. Full-scale massacres, severe human rights violations. Estimates suggest between 30,000 and 60,000 Iraqis, mostly civilians, were killed during the suppression of these uprisings.
30 to 60,000.
A horrifying toll. Beyond the immediate killing field, hundreds of Shia clerics and their students were arrested and simply vanished in the aftermath. Key figures who could potentially rally opposition were eliminated. And the Marsh Arabs, that ancient community in the southern wetlands, faced particularly severe oppression. Thousands disappeared after being taken into custody during military operations in the marshes.
And the marshes themselves were targeted.
Yes. Starting in the early 90s, the government began a massive project to drain the marshes. They claimed it was for land reclamation or border security.
But the real reason?
The real reason was to destroy the unique environment that sustained the Marsh Arabs' way of life and provided potential shelter for insurgents. It effectively destroyed the livelihoods and cultural heritage of thousands, rendered vast areas infertile. It was ecological warfare driven by paranoia.
It's just layers upon layers of control and cruelty. You mentioned something earlier, that even mourning the dead was forbidden.
Yes, a truly telling detail. Mourning those killed by the regime was itself a crime. Public displays of grief were suppressed. The regime wanted to control everything, even private sorrow, even memory. But despite this, after the regime fell in 2003, observers reported seeing black mourning banners appear on nearly every house in some streets, especially in the South. A silent testament to the widespread grief, the defiance that had been forcibly suppressed for so long.
That's a powerful image. The silence finally broken. Beyond these huge crackdowns, how did the regime use collective punishment and target families specifically to maintain its grip? That seems like such a cynical exploitation of human bonds.
Oh, profoundly cynical. The regime understood that family and community bonds were the strongest ties in society. So its strategy was to systematically break those bonds, weaponize them. It actively encouraged citizens to report on their families, their neighbors, created this pervasive atmosphere of distrust and fear. You literally couldn't be sure who might denounce you, a neighbor, a colleague, even a relative. The mukhabarat could strike at any moment.
Incentivizing betrayal.
Exactly. Either through reward or, more often, through the threat of unimaginable punishment if you didn't cooperate, if you stayed silent. It just corroded the very foundation of social trust.
Are there specific examples that illustrate this targeting of families?
There are countless harrowing accounts. One tells of a man whose only crime was selling a car to a group the regime later decided was hostile. His punishment: he was hung up by his arms. While he was suspended, his wife was stripped naked, burned with cigarettes, and beaten brutally right in front of their children.
In front of the children?
Yes, this wasn't about information. It was about inflicting maximum psychological and physical agony on the entire family unit, to break their spirits completely, and to demonstrate that everyone was reachable, everyone vulnerable, no one was safe. Another account just devastates. A
Yeah.
doctor who was resisting interrogation, not giving the information they wanted. The interrogators brought in his 3-month-old baby daughter.
No.
They tore out the baby's eye
Oh.
and then threw the screaming infant against a concrete wall, smashing her skull
That's
right in front of him.
I have no words. That's not just cruelty. It's monstrous.
It is. And these weren't isolated acts of some rogue, sadistic guard, though there was plenty of that too. This kind of extreme violence against family members was a calculated method, a tool used systematically to break individuals and terrify communities into absolute submission. It shows that complete absence of empathy, that core characteristic of psychopathy, combined with a paranoia that saw any non-compliance as an existential threat to be wiped out by the most shocking means imaginable.
So, beyond the physical violence, the regime built this society gripped by absolute control, dictating seemingly every aspect of life. What were the mechanisms for crushing political or social dissent? How did this feel in daily life for ordinary Iraqis?
The foundation was pervasive fear, deliberately cultivated, born from Saddam's paranoid need for total control. People described Iraq then as just a terrifying place to live. Constant dread, fear of being denounced, fear of the knock on the door in the middle of the night, the security services, the mukhabarat, the alam, others they operated with absolute impunity. They could strike anytime, anywhere, for any reason, or often for no stated reason at all, just to remind people they were being watched.
And this fear was actually written into law.
It was institutionalized. In 1992, Saddam's Revolutionary Command Council passed a decree granting full immunity to members of the ruling Ba'ath Party.
Immunity for what?
For causing damage to property, inflicting bodily harm, or even killing someone while pursuing supposed enemies of the regime. They faced no legal repercussions. It was literally a license to kill, empowering party members to act with unconstrained aggression.
So the law protected the aggressors, not the victims.
Completely inverted the concept of justice and political participation. It was exclusively reserved for Ba'ath Party members. That was only about 8% of the population. No genuine opposition was tolerated. Public assembly was illegal unless it was exclusively in support of the government. The regime controlled the formation and activities of all political parties. There was simply no space for dissent.
What about just moving around the country or leaving?
Chilling restrictions. Iraq became a virtual open-air prison. Police checkpoints everywhere prevented travel between governorates without government permission. If you wanted to travel abroad, you needed an expensive exit visa, and you had to post collateral first, often your house deeds, or a huge sum of money, forfeited if you didn't return.
Collateral to leave your own country.
Yes, and Iraqi women were explicitly forbidden from traveling outside Iraq without a male relative escorting them. Control extended to personal autonomy, movement, everything.
And the ethnic cleansing tactics, the Arabization you mentioned, how did that fit into this broader political and social repression? It sounds like trying to engineer the population itself.
Exactly. It was a relentless campaign targeting non-Arabs, especially Kurds, Turkmen, Assyrians, in strategic areas like oil-rich Kirkuk and other northern districts. The tactic was called Arabization.
And the goal?
To displace populations seen as potentially disloyal or pro-insurgent, and replace them with Arabs considered loyal to the Ba'athist regime, particularly in those valuable oil field regions. It was about solidifying Arab control, removing potential sources of internal opposition, driven again by that deep paranoia about national unity defined solely on Ba'athist Arab terms.
How did they implement it? Forcibly remove people?
Yes, forced displacement was common. But also, they incentivized poor Arab families from southern Iraq to relocate to places like Kirkuk, offer them cheap housing in new government-built complexes, money, jobs. It was a state-sponsored demographic shift. They also used bureaucratic tools. There was a census in October 1987. If you failed to show up and register, you could lose your Iraqi citizenship, just cease to exist legally. Precisely. Most Kurds, knowing the regime's tactics, refused to participate, understanding the danger of officially acknowledging their presence to a government that sought to erase them. And alongside this, the regime carried out a continuous campaign of unlawful killings targeting political opponents. Estimates run well over 10,000 such assassinations just since 1979.
Assassinations. And I read something truly disturbing, using sexual assault as a political tool.
Yes. Shockingly, the regime employed sexual assaults against women, often the wives, daughters, or sisters of opposition figures, as a deliberate tool of intimidation, using the most personal, violating act imaginable as a weapon to break political leaders. There was also a systematic campaign of murder and intimidation against clergy, particularly Shiite religious figures. They represented an alternative source of authority, a potential challenge to the secular Ba'athist state, and so they were seen as threats to be neutralized.
This level of control must have extended to information itself, right? The truth seems like it would have been incredibly dangerous to Saddam's regime.
Absolutely critical. Controlling the narrative was just as important as physical control. Saddam's government maintained an iron grip on all information. Journalists inside Iraq, especially foreign ones, were assigned government minders. These minders controlled where they went, who they spoke to, what they saw, ensuring only the regime's carefully crafted version of reality got out.
So no independent view.
Virtually impossible. The regime actively blocked UN humanitarian experts from assessing the true living conditions or the extent of suffering. Major international aid organizations were barred from operating freely, especially in sensitive areas. Any statistics or official statements coming out of Iraq during that time were highly suspect, often manipulated for propaganda. Saddam famously refused entry to UN human rights rapporteurs for years.
Why? What was he so afraid they'd find?
He was clearly terrified of the truth getting out. The truth about the mass graves, the torture centers, the scale of the disappearances, the chemical attacks. This elaborate system of concealment, this wall of denial, it really demonstrates not just his disregard for life, but also that deep narcissistic need to project an image of strength, order, infallibility, even if it meant burying evidence of unimaginable atrocities.
And the evidence eventually did come out, didn't it? The mass graves.
Yes. After 2003, numerous mass graves were uncovered across Iraq, containing thousands upon thousands of bodies. Many were victims of the 1991 uprising suppression, but it went beyond that. Evidence emerged of routine prison cleansing campaigns, systematic executions within the detention centers. For example, reports indicate 4,000 inmates were killed in just one prison, Majar, in 1984. Another 2,500 were executed there between 97 and 99.
Thousands executed just to clear prisons.
That appears to be the case. Another report detailed 3,000 prisoners being machine-gunned to death in Majar between 1993 and 1998. These weren't isolated events. They were systematic purges to eliminate perceived enemies and perhaps make space, reflecting a chillingly efficient and aggressive approach to managing the prison population.
This level of control is horrifying. But the regime went even further than killing and imprisoning. It actually used physical mutilation as an official, recognized form of punishment. What kind of atrocities are we talking about?
Yes, this is one of the most grotesque aspects. The regime institutionalized physical mutilation. These weren't just acts of torture during interrogation, they were formal penalties designed to punish, permanently mark, and terrorize the population. Visible warnings. For example, cutting off tongues was an official penalty for slandering Saddam Hussein or his family.
Cutting off tongues. Officially.
Officially. There are horrific accounts. One victim, Farah Salman, survived, but spoke with a slur because part of his tongue was missing, pulled out with pliers, sliced off with a box cutter by the Fedayeen Saddam militia in front of his family and neighbors. And it wasn't just for criticizing Saddam. Another chilling story involves a Fedayeen member himself losing his tongue just for repeating a critical comment someone else made about Uday Hussein, Saddam's son. It shows even those inside the system weren't safe from this arbitrary cruelty.
What other kinds of mutilation?
Ear amputation was common. Hundreds, maybe thousands of Iraqis who refused military service or were caught deserting had their ears sliced off. Or they were branded, often with a large X carved or burned onto their foreheads.
Who carried this out?
Often, doctors were forced to do it, paid by the regime, coerced under threat of suffering the same fate themselves. One survivor, Anwar Abdul Razak, described having his ears sliced off without painkillers, then being thrown into a jail cell with 750 other men, all similarly disfigured. They were mockingly called Abu Erlis, father of the earless. Doctors confirmed being compelled to perform these brutal procedures.
Doctors forced to mutilate people. And eye gouging.
Yes, that was listed as a method of torture and sometimes execution. There are accounts, truly sickening accounts, of children having their eyes gouged out in front of their parents to force confessions.
Children?
Yes, an act of almost unimaginable depravity designed to break a parent's will. We have testimony from torture victims who explicitly stated their eye was poked out. Another survivor, Kadim Sabat al-Dataji, had a glass eye and would reportedly demonstrate how he lost his real one to torture by popping the glass eye out for visitors. A constant grim reminder.
What else? Branding. Chilling hands.
Physical branding was explicitly approved as an official punishment. Drilling through hands was documented as a particularly lurid and painful form of torture. Even athletes weren't spared. Poor performance could lead to mutilation, amputation of fingers or ears, or bizarre punishments like being forced to kick concrete balls.
Concrete balls.
Yes, a cruel inversion of their sport, reflecting the regime's control over absolutely every public sphere and Hussein's particular sadism in overseeing sports. And then there were the Saddam's Lion Cubs youth camps. Reports emerged of teenagers there being videotaped while being forced to rip flesh from dead dogs with their teeth.
With their teeth? Why?
A deeply traumatizing, barbaric ritual, likely designed to dehumanize them, brutalize them, instill absolute obedience and aggression, conditioning them for the regime's violence.
These acts of physical mutilation, they point to such a deep well of sadism. But what were the broader, more systematic torture practices used in the prisons? How did they embody this calculated cruelty?
Torture was absolutely routine, widespread, and incredibly sadistic in the regime's prisons. Places like Abu Ghraib, Hakimiyya, Radwaniyya, they were infamous. And the intent often wasn't just to extract information, although that was part of it. Primarily, it was about breaking the human spirit, inflicting sustained, extreme suffering to ensure utter compliance and demonstrate the state's absolute terrifying power. It was a core component of control, reflecting that deep psychopathy.
What kinds of physical torment were common?
Horrifying range.
Sure.
Victims were routinely blindfolded, stripped naked, and suspended by their wrists from the ceiling or hooks for hours, even days. This often resulted in dislocated shoulders, permanent nerve damage. One survivor, Radi Ismail Makedi, permanently lost the ability to lift his hands above his head because of this. Another woman, Hashmiya, described being hung from a hook and beaten relentlessly on the soles of her feet until her toenails fell off.
Electric shocks.
Oh yes, applied everywhere. Genitals, ears, tongues, fingers, nipples. Mohsen Muthor Olga described these experiences. Ali Kadem el-Esri endured having his knuckles smashed with a club, then electrodes on his genitals, being hung until his shoulders dislocated, and whipped constantly with cables. Beatings were constant, using anything available, canes, whips, thick hose pipes, metal rods, often targeting the soles of the feet, the falaka, because it's excruciatingly painful, but leaves fewer visible marks initially. Prisoners in Majar jail reported being beaten twice a day, just as routine.
Even athletes, you said.
Yes. Tarek, a national soccer player, recalled being beaten with plastic cables, forced to swim in knee-deep sewage water, dragged bare-chested across hot asphalt, made to run barefoot over broken glass and gravel. After beating, sometimes guards would throw salt water on their open wounds to increase the pain and ensure lasting scars. Physical reminders of their failure and the regime's power. There were also documented accounts of acid baths. Specific reports of battery acid being deliberately spilled on prisoners' feet, causing horrific burns and permanent deformity. And other methods like forcing objects like broken bottles into the anus. Just sheer sadistic cruelty.
It's almost unbearable to hear, and the psychological torture must have been just as devastating, running alongside the physical pain.
Absolutely. Psychological torture was deeply integrated, often seen as even more effective at destroying a person in the long run. A common tactic was forcing victims to watch others being tortured, sometimes strangers, sometimes cellmates, sometimes horrifyingly their own family members, spouses, children, parents, siblings. Imagine the trauma leveraging love and connection to break someone's resistance.
Death threats against family.
Constant threats of raping female relatives, wives, daughters, mothers, sisters, chillingly common. And sometimes these threats were carried out, just shattering families, destroying minds. Mock executions were also regular occurrences, making prisoners believe they were about to die over and over again, keeping them in a perpetual state of terror.
Were there other, maybe stranger forms of psychological torture?
Yes, designed to erode sanity, induce hopelessness. Prisoners were subjected to absurd, pointless, torturous tasks, like being put in a tiny red, windowless cell filled with tiny stones in order to count them, then beaten, regardless of the answer, or being forced to ride an imaginary bicycle drawn on the cell wall for hours, or being ordered to catch a specific number of flies and mosquitoes, then interrogated about the gender of the insects and beaten whatever they said.
It sounds insane.
It sounds insane, but it was calculated. These acts stripped prisoners of dignity, agency, their sense of reality, utterly dehumanizing. Isolation and sensory deprivation were also key. One man described being put in a compressed room, less than a meter high, unable to stand or lie down properly to sleep for days on end. Others were confined to what they called casket prisons. Sinal Tarbut.
Casket prisons.
Yes, basically confined in mortuary-style boxes, barely able to move. Opened only briefly each day for air, maybe some food, maybe more torture. In Cortilla jail, prisoners were kept in steel boxes the size of tea chests, with open mesh floors that served as the only toilet. Conditions designed to utterly isolate and break the individual.
And Saddam's son, Uday Hussein,
Yeah.
you mentioned his sadism. He seems to have been personally involved in a lot of this depravity, almost a caricature of his father's worst traits.
Uday was notoriously involved, yes. He oversaw and personally participated in horrific acts of sadism, operating with total impunity. His cruelty was legendary, even within the regime. He seemed to embody the absolute, unrestrained power of the ruling family and the psychopathic tendencies that came with it.
What kinds of things was he accused of?
He was widely accused of the systematic rape and murder of young women. He reportedly had his own private torture chamber. We mentioned him ordering the national football team caned on the soles of their feet after losing matches. He took sports incredibly personally. There are accounts of him engaging in shocking personal violence, like reportedly ripping off a guard's ear with his teeth, then using a welder's torch on the man's face, forcing entertainers at his parties to drink excessive amounts of alcohol, often drugged, until they collapsed or needed their stomachs pumped, purely for his amusement.
Ripping off an ear using a welder's torch.
Truly grotesque. Another chilling account comes from someone described as Uday's chief executioner, who claimed to have witnessed Uday order two 19-year-olds thrown into a cage with lions and watch them being devoured.
Thrown to lions.
That's the testimony. Uday was also described as being obsessed with women, allegedly keeping monkeys in a cage in his private club's kitchen to watch him deflower virgins. One particularly harrowing story involves an 18-year-old bride being abducted from her wedding party, dragged to one of Uday's properties, raped repeatedly, and her body later found dumped, showing signs of acid burns and having flesh peeled off.
It's beyond monstrous. It's evil.
The accounts are deeply disturbing. He famously used an Iron Maiden, a medieval torture device, on Iraqi athletes who disappointed him. He ordered a media official he frequently beat for minor mistakes to carry a falaka stick in his car at all times, just so it was handy for the next beating. His cruelty was pervasive, personal, and seemed almost recreational for him.
Hearing about Uday and the descriptions of places like Abu Ghraib, it paints a picture of the prisons as entire worlds of nightmare. What were the broader conditions like in these facilities beyond the specific torture acts?
Places like Abu Ghraib were huge, terrifying complexes, holding tens of thousands of prisoners. They functioned as these self-contained universes of suffering and arbitrary cruelty. You hear accounts that give a sense of the scale and the disregard for life. Like 12-year-old Iranian boys swept up during the Iran-Iraq War who simply remained imprisoned for 15 years, lost their entire youth inside those walls forgotten. Testament to the arbitrary detentions, the lack of any due process.
And the disposal of bodies. You mentioned a machine.
Yes, there were allegations, rumors among inmates and guards of some prisoners being fed into machines resembling giant industrial meat grinders or wood chippers. Their remains supposedly dumped into the Tigris River. An extreme, horrifying way to dispose of enemies. Guards were certainly seen beating men to death with sticks and cables, sometimes taking an hour to do it, for minor rule breaks or just because they felt like it. Pure displays of power.
What about basic living conditions? Food, sanitation?
Appalling. Extreme overcrowding was standard. Detainees often forced to sleep packed together like spoons, literally body to body. This density, of course, led to rampant disease. Water, when provided, was often polluted. Food was meager, often rotten, leading to widespread malnutrition and death from starvation or related illnesses. One former inmate described being kept in a cell where raw sewage flowed freely across the floor. He said dead bodies would sometimes remain propped upright among the living for days before finally slumping over, and the only reaction from the other inmates was a dull flash of annoyance because they desperately needed the space.
Just numb to death.
The conditions bred that kind of numbness, that focus on sheer survival. The entire prison routine was defined by constant fear. As one former prisoner put it starkly, if you came to the prison, you were always in fear for your life. Survival was never guaranteed. Death was omnipresent. These prisons were truly microcosms of the regime's unconstrained aggression and its complete dehumanization of its perceived enemies.
These accounts are just so deeply disturbing. They point to a regime that didn't just punish individuals, but systematically targeted entire groups. Beyond the major campaigns like Amphal, how else did this persecution manifest against specific ethnic and religious communities?
The regime's policies were fundamentally discriminatory, absolutely. The aim was always to suppress or even eliminate distinct ethnic and religious identities if they were perceived as any kind of threat, actual or potential, to the Ba'ath Party's absolute authority and its Arab nationalist ideology. This was core to Saddam's paranoid worldview. Diversity wasn't strength, it was a threat.
So, for the Kurds, beyond Anfal and Halabja,
The persecution was ongoing. Forced displacement continued right up to the end. An estimated 94,000 Kurds were expelled from their homes just between 1991 and 2003. And there were earlier acts of extreme collective punishment. In 1983, for instance, 8,000 men and boys from one specific Kurdish clan, the Barzanis, were rounded up and executed, simply because they were Barzanis, wiping out an entire male lineage.
8,000 from one clan. And the Shia Muslims. They're the majority in Iraq, but faced immense oppression.
Immense, systematic oppression. Seen as potentially disloyal, influenced by Shiite Iran, and a demographic threat to Sunni Ba'athist dominance.
Yeah.
Beyond the tens of thousands killed or disappeared after the 91 uprising, you had the draining of the southern marshes, which forcibly displaced up to 500,000 Shia Marsh Arabs, destroying their ancient way of life. Earlier in the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, estimates suggest between 50,000 and 70,000 Shia were arrested and never heard from again, just vanished into the regime's black holes. Hundreds of Shia clerics and their students also disappeared after 1991, a clear attempt to decapitate their religious leadership.
And attacks on their holy sites?
Yes, deliberate destruction of Shia religious shrines. Some reports compare the damage in places like Karbala and Najaf after the 91 uprising to the leveling of cities in World War II. It was a direct assault on their cultural and religious heritage, meant to demoralize and erase their identity.
Were other minorities targeted too?
Yes. Turkmen intellectuals were executed, seen as a potential obstacle to Arabization efforts in the north. In 1996, over 40 Iraqi Turkmen were massacred in Erbil. The broader campaign of ethnic cleansing in northern districts like Kirkuk also targeted Assyrians and other non-Arabs, and people classified as ethnic Persians, often Iraqi citizens with Iranian ancestry going back generations, were also subjected to ethnic cleansing, stripped of citizenship and property, and forcibly expelled to Iran. It was a regime obsessed with ethnic and sectarian purity, defined in its own narrow terms.
This level of systematic brutality seems like it must have been underpinned by some kind of legal framework, however twisted, that sanctioned and enforced it all.
Absolutely. Under Saddam, the very idea of law was corrupted. It became just another tool for absolute control, for punishment, often driven by his whims or the party's dictates, rather than any consistent principles of justice. The legal system was weaponized to reinforce his aggression and paranoid control.
Were there specific laws that codified this brutality?
Yes. For example, in June 1994, the regime introduced severe new penalties. Amputation, branding, and the death penalty became mandatory for a wide range of offenses, things like theft, corruption, currency speculation, even military desertion, often carried out publicly to maximize the terror effect.
But these laws didn't apply to everyone equally.
Critically, no. Members of the Ba'ath Party and Saddam's own family were explicitly immune from these brutal punishments. It created this stark two-tiered system. Untouchable elite, terrified populace. The law became completely whimsical. The Constitution was even amended in 2001 to make sodomy a capital offense. Decisions depended entirely on the will of the party, the will of the president. Even things like foreign investment approvals were contingent on the whims and demands of the ruling elite. Deep corruption was just part of the system.
So the state itself was essentially criminal.
Saddam built one of the world's most ruthless police states, and it sustained its power directly through criminal acts. Not just the killings and torture, but systematic looting the property of the Iraqi people, looting neighboring countries like Kuwait. These crimes continued right up until the regime's fall. It was a kleptocracy built on terror. And that meticulous control of information we discussed, denying access to journalists and UN observers, that was part of this framework too. Preventing the truth from getting out was essential to maintaining the facade and avoiding accountability. Any official statistics were unreliable, crafted purely for propaganda. This whole elaborate system of concealment just showed how much Saddam feared the truth.
The internal repression, the atrocities, they're undeniable. But Saddam's ambition, his aggression, wasn't confined within Iraq's borders, was it? It led to the devastating invasion of Kuwait in 1990. What characterized the regime's actions during that occupation? Did it mirror the domestic brutality?
It absolutely mirrored it. The invasion and the 7-month occupation of Kuwait were marked by widespread brutality, showing the exact same disregard for human life, property, and international law that defined the regime internally. His external aggression was just another facet of that same unconstrained personality. There was massive systematic looting, state-sanctioned plunder. Hussein, Saddam's son, reportedly treated Kuwait like his personal used car lot, taking fleets of luxury cars, priceless art, gold from the central bank, anything they desired.
And hostages.
Yes, the regime held thousands of foreign nationals hostage from numerous countries. They were openly used as human shields, placed at strategic sites, and leveraged in attempts to coerce foreign governments into supporting Iraq or deterring military action. A blatant violation of international norms.
What about the Kuwaiti people themselves?
Iraqi forces committed widespread robbery against Kuwaiti civilians and expatriates. There were extensive accounts of rape and sexual violence used as a weapon of terror against both Kuwaiti women and foreign residents, and summary executions of anyone perceived as resisting the occupation were common. Amnesty International documented at least 38 specific methods of torture used by the Iraqi occupiers in Kuwait. Things like severe beatings, breaking limbs, pulling out fingernails and toenails, inserting bottlenecks into victims' rectums, mock executions, the same horrifying repertoire seen inside Iraq.
And the environmental destruction. Setting the oil wells on fire.
A horrific act of environmental terrorism. As Iraqi forces retreated in 1991, they deliberately set fire to over 700 Kuwaiti oil wells. It created an environmental catastrophe, huge plumes of toxic smoke, massive oil spills. A final spiteful act of destruction with long-lasting consequences.
Are there still Kuwaitis missing from that time?
Yes. To this day, the fate of over 600 Kuwaitis who were taken captive during the occupation remains unknown. They were last accounted for in prisons in southern Iraq like Basra, and then they simply vanished without a trace. Their disappearances remain a deep wound for Kuwait.
And before Kuwait, there was the Iran-Iraq War. 8 long, devastating years. How did Saddam's tactics of extreme violence, his willingness to break international rules, play out on that international stage?
The Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988 was incredibly brutal, one of the longest and deadliest conventional wars of the 20th century. And it absolutely showcased Saddam's willingness to use abhorrent methods on an international scale, methods that clearly violated established laws of war. His actions mirrored the psychopathy and unconstrained aggression we saw domestically.
The most notorious aspect was chemical weapons, wasn't it?
Yes. Critically, Saddam's forces unleashed chemical weapons against Iranian soldiers and, in some cases, civilians near the border. This was a direct, egregious breach of the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which Iraq had signed.
How extensive was the use?
Widespread and devastating. According to credible Iranian accounts, supported by international evidence later, approximately 5,000 Iranians were killed by Iraqi chemical weapons just between 1983 and 1988. Tens of thousands more suffered horrific injuries and long-term health problems. Mustard gas, nerve agents like taboon, used repeatedly.
As well, clear war crime.
Unquestionably, it demonstrated a profound disregard for international law for human life, a strategic decision to inflict maximum suffering regardless of the rules.
What about treatment of prisoners of war?
There are also credible reports and later evidence suggesting Iraqi forces executed several thousand Iranian prisoners of war during the conflict. Another grave war crime, a direct violation of the Geneva Conventions protecting POWs. It points again to that complete contempt for established rules and basic humanity. And there's a final chilling detail that speaks to his mindset. Saddam was known to collect and display the helmets of Iranian soldiers killed in battle, using them almost as trophies.
Like trophies?
Yes. A practice some observers likened to the Mongol conqueror Hulagu Khan, who supposedly built pyramids from the skulls of his victims in Baghdad centuries earlier. Whether literal or symbolic, it underscored this brutal, almost medieval approach to warfare and his disregard for human dignity even in death. It cemented his legacy as a figure synonymous with death, devastation, and misrule. And the war itself achieved almost nothing for Iraq, except massive debt and the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives.
So we've journeyed through the dark landscape of Saddam Hussein's regime. We've examined the calculated cruelty, the systematic violence, that profound lack of empathy that seems to define his time in power. From the mass campaigns like Anfal to the horrors of Halabja to the individual sadistic torture in prisons like Abu Ghraib. The evidence we've discussed strongly suggests a personality consistent with profound psychopathy, malignant narcissism, a leader who inflicted just unimaginable suffering on hundreds of thousands of people.
The picture that emerges is indeed deeply disturbing, consistent across decades in different contexts: internal repression, external aggression.
It really leaves us, and perhaps you listening, with a stark, uncomfortable question to consider. If a leader's actions so clearly, so consistently, demonstrate such a terrifying psychological profile, what responsibility do the surrounding structures, both within the nation and internationally, have in recognizing that reality? And crucially, confronting it before it consumes an entire nation and destabilizes regions.
That is a critical question, isn't it? It forces us to look beyond just the individual, monstrous as his actions were, and ask how such a regime could flourish, could persist for so long. It demands we think critically about the systems, the political silence, the economic interests, the international indifference sometimes that might enable such individuals to rise, to consolidate power, and to wield it with such unchecked brutality.
It really challenges us to think about vigilance, about intervention, about accountability on a global scale. What allows such darkness to take root and spread?
Precisely. It's not just about diagnosing the past, but about considering the mechanisms, or lack thereof, that failed to stop it sooner. What systemic failures allowed these atrocities to continue for decades?
Indeed. Heavy questions with no easy answers. We invite you to reflect on these uncomfortable truths and consider what lessons we must draw from this dark chapter of history. Thank you so much for listening to this deep dive. If you found this discussion thought-provoking, please like, share, and subscribe. As always, have a nice day or good night and stay safe. See you on the next one.